Seville Orange, a therapeutic story about mindful eating and embracing the present moment. Once upon a time, there lived a little girl called Rosa. She was, for the most part, a happy little girl who loved her life. She lived in the beautiful city of Granada, near the magnificent Alhambra Palace. Every morning she would run past the pearl set in emeralds on her way to her grandmother's house. She was familiar with all the long pathways, the ancient cobble streets, the serene patios, the lush green parks, and the lanes which would take her straight to her abuela's house, where she would look forward to her favourite tortilla. Her abuela Maria was a most magnificent woman. She was fiercely proud of her Andalusian roots. Her memories, her character, and her love for Rosa were all reflected in the delicious variety of food she prepared. As Rosa ran into her grandmother's courtyard, she could hear so much life around her. In the distance, there was the sound of birds singing. She noticed the smell of the lemon trees, and she could see her grandmother's kitchen. As she ran towards it, she could almost taste the wonderful abundance of flavours. "Abuela, Abuela, I'm home!" Rosa cried out. Her grandmother lovingly reached out to her. "How are you, my darling girl? Are you hungry?" "Always, Abuela, always," Rosa replied. Her abuela finished making her 2 sweet recipes and carefully plated them up. Rosa loved her afternoons with her grandmother. She idolised her and was inspired by everything she represented. As Rosa waited for her food, she began to gaze at her grandmother's floor. She could see endless decorative, vivid patterns and the colours of her beautiful Andalusia captured in the Mercian-style hexagonal tiles. She was so immersed that she almost lost track of time, staring at all the wonderful colours. "Rosa, focus," her grandmother called out. "Sorry, Abuela, you know how much I love your tiles," Rosa replied. "I know, you lose yourself in them every time you come here," her grandmother lovingly replied. "How was your day, Rosa?" inquired her grandmother. "It was okay, Abuela," Rosa replied. "Just okay?" Rosa had a hard time at school, and some of the children in her class had been making fun of her. She didn't want to say anything about it because she didn't want to upset anyone or cause a fuss. However, the situation had been going on for some time, and Rosa would often rush to her abuela to try to forget. She loved the tranquility of her garden and all of the beautiful aromas in her large Spanish kitchen. Once she was there, it was easy to forget, to dream and remember happier times. It was a safe place to which Rosa could escape. As Rosa retreated into the dining room, her abuela called out to her again. "Rosa, there is something I would like you to taste," she said. And she went over to the tray to pick up one of Rosa's favourite Andalusian foods of all time, polvorón. Since she was a little girl, Rosa had always loved polvorón, and no one made it quite like her abuela. Polvorón is a deliciously sweet cookie made from 5 simple ingredients. Rosa could never understand how these 5 straightforward ingredients could create something so utterly tasty, such an extraordinary treat. "Come over here, Rosa, and sit down. I would like you to taste this." Rosa looked at her grandmother's expression and the kindness in her face, and she felt confused. "This is my favourite cookie, Abuela. Why are you asking me to taste it?" she said with a puzzled expression on her face. Rosa knew exactly what they tasted like already. "I always help you make them," she exclaimed. Her abuela paused. "Today, Rosa, you will savour everything I make with fresh relish. You will taste life, every single bit of it, through my food." Rosa was even more confused. Life didn't taste of anything, and even if it did, there were parts she wouldn't want to taste, like earlier that day when she had run away from school. The sweet fragrance of the cookies filtered through the room. It was a warm day and the air was quite still. It was as if the air had trapped the aroma and it enveloped Rosa. She felt as though she was safely encased in warm pastry with her grandmother as a sweet filling that protected her. Rosa was covered in the wonderful and comforting tang of her abuela's polvorón. Despite her love of good food, Rosa's mind would often drift back to school where all of her problems were. This made her so unhappy. She wanted to forget, but she found it difficult to do so. Why couldn't her school be like her grandmother's kitchen and everything it represented? Rosa seemed to learn more there than at school anyway. Her grandmother asked her to take a deep breath. Now, Rosa, very slowly bite into a cookie. Rosa did exactly as her grandmother had asked. She took a deep, slow, and steady breath. Then she very carefully took a small bite into a cookie. She could taste the smoothness before the taste very quickly dissolved in her mouth. Rosa, that was too quick, her grandmother exclaimed. You must use all of your senses when you eat your food: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. What do you see? A biscuit, replied Rosa. Look again, but before you give me your answer, I would like you to think beyond what you see on the surface. Her grandmother put her arm around Rosa's shoulders. Feel it with your heart. I feel love. Abuela smiled. Rosa had never eaten any food in this way before, and she noticed the heightened sensations. Around the kitchen, she noticed lemons, bottles of olive oil, jars of herbs, and the braided strings of garlic heads. What do you hear? She focused on her grandmother's question. What do I hear? She wondered. As she closed her eyes, she remembered her grandmother speaking to her when she was just 5 years old. Puedes saborear el suave y cremoso sabor de la mantequilla. Can you taste the smooth, rich flavour of butter? The lilt of her voice, the warmth of her embrace, and the sweet, woody, slightly citrus, spicy flavour and aroma of cinnamon. She heard it as if it were an echo. Be curious, Rosa. Make observations. Notice subtle details. Pause. Savour every mouthful. Never feel guilty. As her grandmother said these words, Rosa ate in complete silence. She focused on how the biscuit made her feel instead of worrying about what was happening at school. She could taste each of the ingredients. The crushed almonds were woody, toasty, and slightly earthy. She felt grounded, and she imagined a strong and sturdy tree. Next was the taste of butter, which was soft, creamy, and rich with a hint of sweetness, like her grandmother. Next, she could taste the cinnamon, which made her think back to the first time she ate the cookies in her abuela's kitchen. And lastly, there was the sweet and syrupy taste of sugar. As Rosa savoured the last mouthful, her grandmother brought out some pestiños she had made. The pieces of deep-fried dough, which were generously dipped in honey, were so wonderfully sweet. Her abuela always added aniseed, orange, cloves, and cinnamon, and the taste always filled her mouth towards the end. They were drenched in olive oil, which made them melt on her tongue. Come, let's take a walk. You can finish them in the garden. Rosa was very lucky because her grandmother lived just a stone's throw away from a beautiful olive grove. There was an abundance of wildflowers, some of which she used in her baking. You see, how you eat is a reflection of your life. Rosa didn't quite understand, but as she finished the last of the pestiños, she decided to listen more intently to her grandmother's words. When you take your time and relish each mouthful, you will see, hear, touch, and taste so much. It will make you feel grateful for everything you have. Gratitude is the key to happiness. The next morning, Rosa woke up feeling quite sprightly. She got ready for school, imagining this newfound happiness as a fairy of protection. As she walked into school, she noticed the other children staring at her. She walked past the girls. She realised that they were all making fun of her. They imitated her and laughed aloud. They were terribly unkind. Rosa ignored the other children and went to class as normal, but this time she walked differently and she made sure she held her head up high. Soon it was lunchtime. Rosa rushed out to the school courtyard. She sat down and opened her lunchbox. She was excited to see what her abuela had prepared for her. Mojo picon, Spanish red pepper sauce. Oh, grandmother, that's my favourite, she thought to herself. A couple of the girls stared at her as she was about to eat, but Rosa didn't care. She dipped her crusty bread into the delicious sauce and closed her eyes. She could taste the warmth of the cumin. Its flavour lingered on her taste buds. It was slightly spicy, and she could feel the heat rising up. The other girls began to laugh, and as they laughed, Rosa could feel that spicy sensation. She could taste the hot peppers on her tongue. What she was eating seemed to mirror what was happening to her. She looked at the deep red sauce, and it was as if she could only see and feel the strong sensation of the colour red. The girls continued to stare intently at Rosa. Rosa got very nervous, but then she remembered what her grandmother had taught her. She had explained that being aware of what you were eating, paying full attention to the colours, aromas, and associated stories and feelings was one of life's most powerful gifts. Rosa, she would say, eat every mouthful without distraction. Stay in the moment. Don't allow yourself to be distracted by what is going on around you. Take note of what is going on in your body, inside your mind. How do you feel? Remember, everything around you is a mirror of how you see yourself, your thoughts and feelings. Your external world is your internal world reflected. Don't be hard on yourself, dear Rosa. Listen to your feelings without judgment. They are telling you what you need to know. Rosa's grandmother had always validated her feelings. She had never dismissed them. Instead, she would name them and would always compare them to an item of food. It was an easy way for Rosa to recognise how she was feeling and to know that feelings are always changing. She loved linking her emotions to colour. With that, Rosa closed her eyes once more. She placed a spoonful of the sauce in her mouth, and suddenly she was transported back to her grandmother's kitchen. She could taste the fiery red peppers, but could also taste and fully appreciate the peppery sauce. As she focused on the present moment, the spicy flavour seemed to fade, and she was left tasting the smoky flavour of the sauce. She swirled it around in her mouth. She realised that this is what life was like. Sometimes there are bitter moments when you can taste the fire, the angry reds, and then at other times it can be sweet, like orange or yellow, much like the polvoron her abuela would make. Once Rosa had finished eating the sauce, she noticed that her grandmother had included a slice of bread, spread with homemade Seville marmalade. Her grandmother knew she didn't much like this fruit, but Rosa realised that her grandmother's wisdom was inside this lunchbox. Rosa's grandmother was actually from Seville. She would take Rosa to her beautiful home every summer and every winter. They would walk hand in hand down the picturesque streets of Old Seville, which were lined with dazzlingly bright orange trees. Just after Christmas, the wonderful sweet aroma of oranges would fill the air, and they would give off the most beautiful glow. But no one looked at these wonderful fruits in the same way as Rosa's grandmother did. She would embrace the texture of the orange's bitter skin with its wrinkled outer layer and its sour juice. She would compare it to life. Rosa, do you see how everyone naturally dismisses this fruit? Who would want such a bitter and sour fruit, she would say. But what happens when you combine it with other ingredients? Its delicious, distinct orange aroma is complemented by the tanginess of lemons. Darling girl, this wonderfully rich spread combines bitter, sweet, and sour tastes to create a balanced flavour. This is life. Without the sour, spicy, and the bitter, you cannot have the sweet, nor can you have balance. Rosa understood. She finished what she was eating and then she paused. She listened to her own internal voice which told her, "You are strong, you are authentic, you do not need to be the same as everyone else. You are perfect just the way you are." With that realization, Rosa stood up. She stood tall and she smiled at the girls. She walked past them without so much as a sideways glance back to her grandmother's house. As she walked along the cobbled street, she could taste the sour, sweet, and bitter tones of the orange jam. She noticed its refreshing, tangy taste, and she felt the brightness of the colour orange. It was almost as if she could feel its warm glow. She could feel the stickiness of the fruit on her hands, but it reminded her of her grandmother's love and all the times they had peeled the oranges to make the marmalade for the family. She could hear her grandmother calling out to her. She remembered her grandmother's squeezing the juice and the way it would filter between her fingertips. Her fingers would end up so sticky afterwards. Her abuela would always remind her of the important relationship between touch and taste. Her grandmother had a special way of making her understand. Every time she had this marmalade, she was transported back to the orange tree-lined streets of old Seville. She began to chew on the last piece, which she had saved for the walk home. She chewed on it slowly and closed her eyes whilst exploring the depth and detail of each flavour. She deliberately chewed on it for a long time so that the taste, the memories, the colours, and her grandmother's love and wisdom would continue to linger on for just a little bit longer.